Well, for this project we're going to do a wall mirror. Well, technically not a mirror, but a frame to hold a mirror. And not just an ordinary simple frame, but something that's quite attractive. Now, as you can see along the sides of that mirror, we've got two columns. Well, they're half columns and they're veneered MDF. So we're going to explore the techniques involved with veneering these columns as well as turning them up and getting them trued and so forth. We've got a couple of shelves at the top and bottom. There's been a number of challenges during the construction of this project that will easily transcend into other woodworking projects. So all around, it's an excellent project where we can gain lots of new or additional skills for woodworking. Let's not delay any further. Let's jump right in and start on the construction. The back panel for our mirror is going to be constructed of 3/4 inch MDF. Now, I chose MDF for a number of reasons. Primarily what I wanted was a nice uniform texture. After all, this is actually just going to be black. Black is going to make the rest of the elements of the mirror really stand out. Black is a very good background. We could paint this black, we could stain it black. Frankly, I'm just not sure which way I'll color it yet, but either way, MDF makes for a nice uniform surface for which to create that plain black background. Now, what we want to do, of course, is rip it to its overall size first. Now, the edges from the factory are often rough sawn and relatively unattractive. So what I'm going to do is rip it a 1/2 inch oversize on both dimensions and then adjust the fence in to clean it up so that all 4 edges of it are nicely finished. What I'm doing now is going through the process of laying out where I want the opening for the mirror. Now, of course, we'll have to machine a rabbet on the back side to accommodate that mirror. Now, what I want is a 3/8 inch wide rabbet all the way around. So my opening has to be 3/4 inch smaller in length and width than the size of the mirror that's going in there. The mirror opening is centrally located. Now, you may be looking at this right now going, gee, Chris, why didn't you just make this out of 4 boards and then glue them up? Well, no matter how I orient this joint, it's going to be a butt joint and it's going to be a weak point on the whole system. So if I make it out of one continuous piece, it's going to be stronger. It will require more work, but sometimes it's just simply worth it. Now, because these surfaces or edges here are going to be visible, we have to make them look good. So we can't just take a jigsaw and go hacking away in here, or even a circular saw for that matter. So really about the best tool that I can think of to cut this opening is to set up the router. I'll use a small 1/4 inch diameter router bit, an upcut spiral probably, and we'll go through and cut out that surface using clamp-on straight edge guides. And that'll get us our opening. As I mentioned, I'm using a solid carbide router bit, 1/4 inch diameter, and it's a spiral fluted. And of course, it's made by Whiteside. Now, what I need to do is measure the distance from the edge of the router bit to the edge of the router base to determine my offset distance for the clamp-on tool guide. Now, with my offset marked on the workpiece, I can set my straight edge clamp in place and we can begin cutting. And a quick check to make sure I'm lined up properly. And another thing you'll notice is I've got my dust collection hooked up on my router base. When cutting MDF, this stuff is just miserably dusty to work with, so use every weapon at your disposal to help collect that dust. Now, another important part about the center panel, it's going to be used as stock to help us make the columns. So hopefully you take your time and get a nice piece out of that. I've flipped over my panel, because this will be the back side, just based on the texture and so forth. I chose the smoothest surface for the front. Now I'm making sure that it's raised up off my workbench again. And now what we want to do is cut in our rabbet. So we'll get our rabbeting bit set up and get that operation out of the way, and then we can get a lot of this dust cleaned up. I've got a rabbeting bit set from Whiteside, and it comes with a number of different diameter bearings on the bottom. And what that allows you to do is adjust it for different with rabbet cuts. Now I want 3/8, so this is the appropriate bearing. So we'll get that tightened up on there. And then the depth of cut, of course, is only limited by the width of the wings on your router bit. So we'll get the bearing on, get the router bit in, we'll adjust our depth and spin around the part. The width of the wings on this router bit are a 1/2 inch. And that's how deep I want my rabbet to be. So it's kind of a pretty easy self-setting depth adjustment. We've got that, we're ready to go. Now what you just seen me machine was a small slot, 1/2 inch wide, and I machined it with a 1/2 inch carbide tipped router bit from Whiteside. Now I want it to be a 1/4 inch up from the bottom of the rabbet. The thickness of my mirror is 1/4 of an inch. That's how I determined that. The 1/2 inch width is arbitrary, and what I'm going to do are cut some small strips of hardwood to fit in here. We'll drive a screw through this surface to hold the mirror against the rabbet. So I've spaced those out, got those machined. Now what we need to do is square up these corners over here. Now most probably your mirror has a small radius there, but not nearly as big as the radius of your rabbeting router bit. So we'll just mark a square spot there, clamp it down, and use a hammer, or a mallet rather, and a chisel and square that up. MDF carves and tools very nicely. Well, I've gone through and taken a fine file and filed up these corners so they're nice and square. The back side, we've gone through, showing you the process of cutting the rabbet, the slots to accommodate the clamps that'll hold the mirror in, and so forth. So now we're ready to turn our attention to the columns. Now the columns will start out as an MDF core, and we're going to wrap around that core some decorative veneer of some sort. I haven't actually selected which species of wood I'm going to use yet, but there'll be 2 half-round columns. So we'll start out by laminating together several thicknesses of this 3/4 inch MDF so that we end up with a large enough blank that we can turn down into a nice cylinder. Now working with that cutout section for where the mirror is going to be, that should help us out a lot because it's almost 29 inches long, and really it needs to be a minimum of about 27 inches. And we'll just start ripping 4.5 inch wide strips until we have enough to make up a 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch stack. What I ended up with is 6 pieces. They're almost 29 inches long, 4.5 inches wide, and it's 3/4 inch thick MDF. Now one of them is a little bit narrower, didn't quite make up the full 4.5 inch width. I'm not going to worry about it. I'll put that at the top of the stack. Remember, when we turn this round, we won't need that full width. Now we've got 6 pieces, and what we're going to be doing is making a pair of half columns. We'll turn it up as a full cylinder to start with, but in order to get it apart, I'm going to put a sheet of paper, newspaper, between these 2 halves, so to speak. And then that paper should help us to release this stack. If it doesn't release well, I'll just run it through the bandsaw, cut it in half, and then we can just run it over the joiner to clean up the surface if needed. So now we just need to start gluing it up and clamp it up to dry. Now for this glue up, I'm just using yellow woodworking glue. With MDF, it soaks up a lot of moisture very rapidly, so I like to apply glue on both surfaces. And it will tack pretty quick because it is drawing the moisture out very rapidly. So get it in position as you put on each stack. There's our layer of newspaper right between pieces 3 and 4. And then we'll just continue building our stack. Now you can see I've placed a couple of cauls across the top of my stack. Now what I'm doing is making sure all the edges are lined up nice, and I'll just clamp everything right down to the top of my workbench. And that should do it. We'll let the glue cure for about 3-4 hours, and then we can move on with our columns. Now I'll just square up the ends here at the compound miter saw. With the blade tilted over at 45 degrees on the table saw, I'll adjust the fence so I can cut off most of the corner and end up with an octagon-shaped piece when I'm done. That'll save a lot of work in the next step. Well, this is one method of going through and rounding over your column if you don't have a lathe. Now it'll take a little bit of time, care, and patience, but you can certainly get this stock rounded up pretty effectively using a hand plane followed up with some sanding. However, I do have a lathe at my disposal, so that's where we're headed next. Now I'm just going to mount this between centers. I got my drive dog in the headstock, cup center in the tailstock. I've already marked the center points, so I'm just going to bring the two in. I don't want to get too carried away with over-tightening anything. I don't want to end up splitting apart the two halves of our column. Remember, there's newspaper between those, so it's not the strongest of joints. But I do want to get my drive dogs engaged and get my cup center engaged, so that we've got something we can work with. Using a rough and gouge, I'll go through and get the part good and round. Now that I've got it pretty round, what I'm doing is checking to try different cutting techniques to see if I can get the finish, the surface finish, to be smooth all the way around. Here what would be like the edge grain on normal wood, we're getting a good cut, nice smooth surface. But on what would be face grain, if this were natural wood, it's almost like it's trying to delaminate the wood fibers on this MDF. So I'm not getting a real smooth finish, which means I may have to do an awful lot of sanding. But either way, I've still got about a 1/4 inch to go, so I'm going to continue turning this round and working on getting the surface finish smooth, as well as the cylinder nice and true. I need a nice uniform cylinder shape across the whole surface. I don't think there's any getting around it. I'm going to have to sand it. But we are round and we're fairly straight at this point. Now when I sand this, I'm using a belt for my belt sander. It's 4 inches wide. And that will help to ensure that I've got a nice straight surface on the sides of this cylinder. Well, the column is good and straight now, and round. And what we want to do is separate the two halves of the column. So what I'm doing is taking a very inexpensive and thin chisel and tapping it in along that glue line where we put that paper. I don't want to rush this. MDF is itself not very strong, and it will actually delaminate if I try to force things. So what I'll do is I'll get the chisel started in, drive it in a little bit, and just leave it sit for a while and let the fibers in the paper start to fail. And hopefully I can force that failure all along that newspaper on our glue joint. So this will take a little bit of time. I'm not going to hurry it. And we'll just let it sit and do its thing. A couple of wooden shims, which serve as nice wedges, also help the process along. Well, the column separated just perfectly. The paper tore in half, and half of the sheet of paper is on one column, half is on the other. That was a success. Now what I need to do is turn my attention to some selections with regard to color and texture. Now I want the top and bottom shelves to be made out of maple. That was my original vision. And the back will be a black. Now pretty much any color goes with black and white. You're always safe there. But it does help to have the colors handy when you're trying to select them. Now I wanted the columns to be very prominent in this design, but I have to be careful about patterns. Now these are the veneers that I have laying around. I have a few others too, but these just seem to appeal to me. Now I have to keep in mind that the texture is going to be very important with regard to how this column looks, so I have to study that very carefully. Now if I take the column and then lay it down, I'm going to have this particular species of veneer with this real wavy pattern. Now, the column is very vertical. It has strong vertical lines to it. So does this veneer. And with that wavy pattern in there, I think it's going to really detract from the look of the mirror and the project as a whole. This particular veneer we've used before. Again, it has a very strong vertical grain to it. Very linear, not very random at all, although there is some curl in it that will help break up that linear direction with the grain pattern, but it's still not working for me. Now originally, my thought was to use this veneer. The pattern is very non-directional. If anything, there's some slight horizontal elements to it with the curl, but it's certainly not vertical. Very, very random, very busy, just very attractive. The problem with it, the veneer that I have, these were seconds, it's not a premium grade veneer. There's some discoloration along the edges, and there's where a knot was, or part of the knot of a tree, there's a small split in one area. And as I wrap this around that column, that's going to open up, so I may have to fill that. So I have to take that into account. But all around, I really think that this veneer for the columns, here's our base or our top and bottom shelf, and then of course the black, which will have virtually no pattern to it whatsoever. These all work very well together. So I think the decision's made to go with this veneer, and I'll try to figure out how I can address that small split in the veneer sheet. Now to bond the veneer onto the column, I'm going to be using my vacuum press. As an alternative, you could of course obtain the iron-on veneers, which have a temperature-cured adhesive on the back where you can iron it right onto the column. You could of course also use contact cement. Sometimes you can get some very good results using contact cement. But I have found it is a bit hit or miss whether it works or not. So we'll have the veneer on top of the column like so in the vacuum press, and then I wanted a caul underneath. It's just nothing more than a piece of MDF, 3/4 inch MDF, that I've wrapped with newspaper because I don't want my column to stick to it. And it's ripped to the same width or just a little bit smaller in width than the diameter of the column. And what that will allow me to do is to wrap the veneer over the column and let it hang over. And then after the vacuum press gets done squishing it, holding it in place, we take it out, and then I can trim up that end nice and flush. Being a rounded surface, it's kind of hard to predict the exact width. So I figured this is the easier way to do it. So I'll get my other caul wrapped up, and then we'll get on to applying some adhesive. For the adhesive, I'm using liquid hide glue. I've had excellent results with liquid hide glue in my vacuum press. An alternative glue would be, of course, polyurethane glue or some of the plastic resin glues. However, those are industrial products. They have one heck of a strong odor to them. I prefer not to work with them because of the strong fumes. Liquid hide glue's just been good for me, so I stick with it. Now I do want to get a nice even coat on the entire surface. I got to make sure I've got a nice consistent film everywhere. So I'll use this foam brush to help spread it around. And you have to watch this MDF. It will soak up that glue very quickly, so be prepared to add more as you work this in. Now I'll get that positioned on top of that caul that we're using on the bottom. Get it centered up. Then take the veneer, center that up. And you'll notice I've got tape. I want that tape to help hold things in alignment while I get things into the vacuum press. Now we need to get everything in our vacuum bag. This first layer of paper is just to prevent any squeeze out from getting on the bag itself. Put the two columns in. And then another piece of heavy paper on top of each of our column halves, again, so that the glue doesn't squeeze out and attach itself to the bag. Now what I'll do is fold over the end, place a couple of cauls on there, and seal the bag. We attach our vacuum hose, and start drawing a vacuum. And I can see already we're going to have a problem because this isn't going to come down in between the valley here, so we'll have to reposition everything. Get that further into the bag as well. And we'll try again. Now you kind of get an appreciation as to why it's so important to have a slow setting glue when doing certain types of woodworking. If this were a fast setting glue, I'd be in a world of trouble already. Well, it's been a couple of days since I've taken these out of the vacuum press. And as you can see, one is still a little bit different than the other. This one came out fine on the first attempt. So that one's basically done. This one, on the other hand, I've had a number of puckers where the veneer would fold up on itself and create a ridge. And I couldn't work it down, of course, after the glue had dried and so forth. So I sanded it all up smooth, and you'll see here some odd coloring. That's a wood filler. So I filled in any low areas and very carefully shaped that back out to fit the curve. And now what I need to do is make another attempt to get the veneer to lay on there, roll out flat, or I should say roll out into a nice curl, and then to, of course, press on there nice and flat and straight. So I just wanted to point out to you that things don't always go as planned, and sometimes you just have to work around the troubles. Now, when working with highly figured veneers like this, as you can see, this really isn't that flat to begin with. And I've got another piece here, and this is part of an experiment. What I did was I just hit it with a little bit of water out of a mister. And that allowed it to curl up, which is really what I want. So I think that's the process I'll follow this time and see if it doesn't work a little bit better. As before, I'll get the glue on there. Put the veneer on. And we'll see if this will cooperate a little bit better. Ooh, it's laying on there nice and round, so to speak. This just might be the trick. And I think we've got it. We'll wrap her up in paper, put it in the bag, and see what happens in about 5 hours. Well, I just pulled the column out of the vacuum bag. Now we're going to cut away the paper and see how things went this time. Now the first thing you'll notice right away is that this heavy paper sticks to the veneer. Now I could avoid this mess by laying wax paper over the top of this and then putting this heavy paper over the top of that. And that would create a barrier to separate the two. The only downside is to that, it will trap the moisture in there and it'll take a lot longer to dry. And being in a bit of a hurry here, I decided to just put the paper directly on it. That'll help draw some of this moisture out of the glue and things will dry much more quickly. But she feels good and smooth, and I think we've got success. Now what I'll have to do is take my sander, and I can just use a random orbit sander, and sand off all this heavy paper and the glue that's squeezed out through the pores of the wood. And then our columns will be basically ready for our next step. Now our next step, of course, is to get this extra block out of here that raised it up off the surface. So we'll just cut away this paper and tape. And hopefully it'll lift right out. Next, I'll go through and remove as much of the paper as I can. Now at this point, you'll have this U-shaped channel here where the block was. And we need to trim off this excess veneer on both sides. And a veneer saw is really about the best way to do that. And what we'll do, we'll just place it on top of a scrap block. This is the veneer saw. We'll lay it flat against this surface in here, holding it flat there, and drag it across our veneer edge. Now this will take several cuts for me because I've got several thicknesses of veneer here. So I'll just carefully take my time cutting through that veneer. Now if you're just going through one thickness of veneer, it'd take about somewhere between 5 and 10 swipes with the veneer saw. But as I mentioned, this will take me a bit longer. And we'll repeat that on the other side. It seems as though virtually every project has its challenges. Now what we're going to be doing next is working on the top and bottom shelves. And they're, for most part, very simple pieces. This was the board that I originally selected, and I had it stored out in the shed. Now we've just transitioned from our fall months into our winter months, and it was down around 0 degrees the other day when I brought it into the shop. And usually I'll bring wood in and let it sit for about a week or two to let it stabilize, to see where it's going to end up naturally. Well, it's pretty well warped and twisted and so forth. It's a beautiful piece of wood. There's some dark streaks in here on the one side, but on the other, the coloring is very uniform. It's a very, very pretty piece of wood, but it's warped and twisted so much so that by the time I plane off all the high spots, I'm probably going to end up with about a 1/2 inch wide piece. And that's going to be just too narrow for us. So that one went out. And instead I found this piece of bird's eye maple. Now again, here's another challenge. This one's nice and flat. It's got a nice texture to it. It's got a medium amount of bird's eye in it. It's generally pretty attractive. It's got good coloring. It's a very white piece of maple, which is really what I wanted anyhow, rather than more of the yellowish color. But it's not long enough where I can make the two shelves out of this piece stacked end to end. So that kind of cramps my style a little bit. It's not wide enough where I can rip them side by side, so that kind of makes it a little bit difficult. But we do know that the shelf is somewhat curved. And at the ends, it's the narrowest point, so I can overlap that area a little bit on our material. So we'll have one shelf here, and they overlap by about 8 inches or so. Now, further complicating this, we need to machine that bevel that will be on the front edge of both shelf pieces. So we need to be able to have a section ripped wide enough at that 4 1/4 inch width over a pretty good length of it, because about almost 2/3 of that front edge will have that beveled edge on it. So we've got to be careful and mindful of that as to how we extract our shelves out of this timber. Further complicating it, this board came off the edge of the log, and you can see the wane here, or the bark edge. The tree was like so, and I have to be mindful of this, because where the back edge of this shelf meets up with our mirror frame, we need it to be a nice, clean, straight butt edge. So to maximize our yield, I have to go through a number of steps here. Now I've gone through and jointed this edge, so I've got a nice true straight edge here for my reference. That'll be the back edge of this particular shelf. That set up the basis as to where I want to start measuring from. So I just kind of roughly penciled in the dimensions and roughly drew in the shelf. This will be the one shelf in this area here. Now I have to make sure that about this much length of it is at the full 4 1/4 inch width. So I can take and bandsaw, or using a jigsaw, cut out this area. Now I'm going to have to cut it pretty tight to the finished dimensions, but not perfect. I just want to make sure I maximize that yield. So I'm going to start by bandsawing away this material to separate the two boards. Then I'm going to create a straight edge at an angle along the back side of this shelf to bring the edge in over here as so. So it'll be angled like this. That will get me past the wane in this area. Then I can joint that edge and then pencil in my dimensions and do my layout from that point. So there's actually a lot of work that goes into extracting two shelves out of a nice, flat, straight board. It always seems every project has its challenges. Now we'll cut that long taper to remove the wane along the back edge of the one shelf. And a couple of quick passes over the jointer, and we'll have a nice straight edge for the back of our shelf. Now I'm going to go through, rip it to 4 3/8 inch wide. I'll explain that a little bit later. Now what I'm going to do is cut off our two shelves so that they're 1/4 inch long. That'll leave us an 1/8 inch on each end. Again, we'll explain that a bit later. Now at this point, I want to turn my attention to machining that bevel that's along the front edge. That's at 26 degrees, so I've tilted my saw blade over at 26 degrees. And I want it to project back about a 1/2 inch. But keep in mind, I've got that extra 1/8 inch of material here, so it'll actually be about 5/8 of an inch. If I go a little bit further up, there's nothing wrong with that. It won't hurt at all. I just want to have a nice bevel on there that'll extend across, upwards of about half the total length of our shelf. Then when we'll cut that curve on there, it'll diminish off into just a whisper fine edge and then continue on with a straight edge going around by the column areas. Now we have to do this beveling operation now, because if we wait until after we cut the curve on the front of these shelves, there's no way to stabilize it for any type of cutting operation. Now, of course, if you had a router bit that had a 26-degree bevel on it, you could pass it over on your router table like so, but again, you still need to have some form of straight guide for that action to occur. So realistically, doing it here at the table saw, tilt it over at 26 degrees, all we have to do is adjust that fence position to cut that bevel on here. Then what I want to do is adjust my fence over so that I have a little bit less than a ½ inch. Now remember, I've got that extra 1/8 inch along the front edge of the shelf. So I'm going to go almost to 7/16 of an inch between the rip fence and then the bottom edge of the saw blade where it meets up with the table surface. Now I'm getting ready to lay out the curve and radii on our shelf. You'll have to work on the back side because it's kind of hard to lay out on that bevel. Now what I've started out with is I've taken and created a layout line up from the back edge 3 1/8 inches up. I've also then made a mark 1/8 inch in from each end because that's that extra material we left on there. I made a mark at the center line and then from the back edge coming forward at 4 1/4 inches. So that gives us pretty much everything we need to do the rest of the layout. Now, just so happens this particular paint can is 6 1/4 inches in diameter. So it works out to a 3 1/8 inch radius. So all I need to do is just line that up with my 1/8 inch mark at the end, 3 1/8 inch mark at the top, and pencil around it. And I'll do the same at the other end. Then if you don't have a paint can of the right size, you can always use a compass. And as you probably guessed by now, I'm using one of my favorite layout tools, a stick of wood and a clamp. I call it a bow. And I'm going to adjust tension on this clamp, which will alter the curvature of the bow until I get it tangent at these 3 points, which would blend in nicely with the radius at the 2 ends and at our 4 1/4 inch dimension at the center line. Once I have that set, I'll just pencil that in, and we're ready for cutting. The reason why I left it 1/8 inch long and 1/8 inch extra wide at this point, imagine, if you will, trying to start this cut right out at the outside point. It's very difficult because the blade keeps wanting to skip away from the edge of the work. By having that extra 1/8 inch of material there, it's much easier to get a start, or a good start, and then as you're cutting along, and we get back to this point, if we cut, or if we did our layout right out to this outer edge, the blade's just going to pop out at some point. You're going to end up with this flat area. Then once again, you're going to have to try and get the blade to start to come back into the cut. By having that extra 1/8 inch of material there, we've got material on both sides of the blade, and it makes for a much more controlled cut. Next up, we need to trim off the ends of our columns so that they fit between the top and bottom shelves. Now you'll notice here, I'll tip this up so you can see a little better, that there's quite a bit of tear out here. We've got a very ragged edge. This was actually just passed over my table saw blade to cut off the end. Now my column, I actually ended up making it about 1 inch too long, which is good because it gave me a chance to take a test cut here to see how the veneer was going to react at the exit side of the cut. And I'm getting a lot of tear out. Now my second attempt is this one. And as you can see, it's a nice crisp cut. Now it's a little bit short here, but it was just a real light skim cut. Now to prevent that tear out, I'm using one of the oldest tricks in the book, and it worked out very well. A little bit of tape will go a long way in an application like this. All I'm doing is applying a band of masking tape around the end, and we'll saw right through that. And that helps hold the veneer from splitting out at the exit side of the cut. And And that tape helps prevent all the tear out, and you end up with a nice cut all the way across. Now, as I mentioned before, I wanted my frame to be a very black in color. Don't have to be spray painted black. In fact, if there's a little bit of the brown showing through on this MDF, that in itself won't be all that bad. But I do want a very dark color, so I'm using a dark stain. This particular stain is called Jacobine, if I'm pronouncing that right. But it's very dark in color, and I used it on another project a while back. I believe it was our shop stool that we had done, and I used it on the masonite or hardboard material to turn that a real dark color. So I'm just going to brush this on, get one or two coats so I get the depth and color just right. And as this dries, you can also take a paper towel and kind of work it in and use that to help blend the density of this black stain. At this point, I've just gone through and stacked up the 5 pieces that make up our mirror. 2 half columns, top and bottom shelves, and then the back frame. Now at this point we can make a couple of determinations, how we're going to finish it, as well as how we're going to perform the joinery. Now frankly, this is nothing more than a frame with some decorative elements added to it. It's not structural, and it's, so to speak, not functional. You're not going to interact with it. So there's really no need to get very exotic and carried away with the joinery. In fact, right now I'm leaning towards just screwing everything together. And that has a distinct advantage. If you remember, I started out by staining this black area, the MDF. Now if I go through, and my plan is to use a wipe-on finish and start wiping on a finish, I could carry that black dye or stain up onto the white maple or the dark brown columns. That could create a lot of problems. Now, if I go through right now and finish each of the 5 pieces separately, applying the top coats, I could then assemble everything and screw it back together again. I wouldn't be able to do glue joinery, I wouldn't be able to use adhesives if I were to apply the top coat on the surfaces that mate together, such as the back edge of our shelves, the front of our back frame, and the back edge of the columns. So I think I'm going down the path of just using some good screws, perhaps like a deck screw or something, to hold all the pieces together, and I'm going to go about finishing it completely in its separate components. It'll make the whole process go a lot more smoothly, plus it gives me a lot more control over the finishing. In fact, by following that procedure, I could actually apply different finishes to the 3 primary components. For example, the back piece, I could have literally just used black paint. The columns, I could use an oil and then follow that up with a wipe-on oil and urethane top coat and then build it up to the gloss that I wanted. The oil will help pop that figure a lot, and then the wipe-on oil and urethane gives it a nice durable surface or finish, plus of course you can control the amount of gloss that you have in it. You can go with flat, satin, or a high gloss. Now the maple top and bottom pieces, they're very, very white in the maple pieces that I've selected. The wood is almost paper white practically. Now if I apply an oil or an oil and urethane top coat over this, it's going to yellow it a little bit. And at first I really didn't want that. In fact, what I had almost thought about doing was applying lacquer to it, because lacquer won't yellow it, and it'll just give it the protection that I wanted. But the more I'm looking at it now, the more I'm thinking I might want it a little bit yellowed. So I'm again giving choice to each of the components, how I finish them, and what the final result will be. So there are advantages to doing finishing before assembly, especially on a project like this, because you can literally select your finish for the species of wood and even the texture of the wood grain that you're working with. So let's move on to some more finishing, and then we can finish this project up. For the top coat finish, I've went back to one of my favorite finishes, a wipe-on oil and urethane product. It's very foolproof to apply, and it yields just outstanding results, and with just a little bit of post-application work, you can get the luster that you want. I'm using a semi-gloss product here. I'm applying it with a cut-up t-shirt, just a cotton cloth, and I flood it on real good first, wet the surface, and then I take that same wet applicator pad and then slowly drag that very lightly across the surface of the wood in the direction of the grain, and that evens out the surface and creates a nice smooth film. You don't want to apply it too heavy because you will get runs. If you apply it too thin, you will get frequent drag marks or dry marks, so to speak, in the finish. In between coats, it's just a matter of polishing it lightly with 4/0 steel wool, or if the surface is a little bit rough on the first couple of coats, you can hit it with either 320 or 400 grit sandpaper. Over the years, you've probably come to realize that I'm not a real big fan of super high gloss finishes on a lot of my furniture pieces. Sometimes I like it, but primarily I like more of a satiny finish. And that's the type of finish that I used on this. However, I also like to have that luster. And waxing it allows me to control that a little bit more. I apply the wax with 4/0 steel wool, and I just buff it in like I'm showing you right now. Then I'll let it sit on there for a few minutes and then wipe off the excess, buffing it with either a heavy shop towel or a terry cloth or something of that nature. And that allows me to get just the right sheen that's comfortable for my eye. What I'm doing now is getting ready to install or assemble the mirror frame. Now I've got the bottom shelf clamped onto the front of our frame. I've got it lined up flush on both ends, flush along the bottom, clamped in place. And of course I've taken that MDF frame itself, placed it on a piece of cardboard so I don't scratch the finish on it. Now what I want to do is just lay out about 5 equally spaced locations along here where we're going to drive in the screws. To hold everything together, I'm using 1¼ inch long, number 8 deck screws. They're for attaching decking together. They've got a nice coating on them. They're a good, strong, durable screw. But I do have to drill a pilot hole, especially with these maple shelves, because they will split on me. And now you can see I've got the mirror frame tipped up. This is the bottom shelf. Here's the bevel. Of course, the bevels are towards the mirror side. I've got the top shelf on and the 2 columns. And what I want to do now is attach the columns to that back frame. So what I'll do is end up drilling through the bottom shelf into the column to get a screw to join the shelf to the column, and then I'll equally space 3 screws along the back edge. Again, using the same screws and drilling pilot holes. Well, the mirror that I picked up at the home center is 20 by 30 inches and 1/4 inch thick, and it's got polished edges on it. This type of mirror is often sold in the bathroom section and by the vanities and so forth, because this type of mirror is actually designed to be fastened directly to a wall using a mastic or some other form of clips. Now what we need to do is attach it to our frame using some small tabs of wood that we'll put in these slots. So what we're going to do is just start out with some 1/2 inch wide by 1/4 inch thick stock. This happens to be maple. I'll go through, and using a circle template, I'm just going to draw a radius on the end of it. It's only going to take me a minute to do this, and it'll make it look much more attractive than to just have a square-ended tab sitting in that rounded slot. Now I'll go over to the belt sander, sand that up round to follow that shape, and then we'll drill a hole and install it. It's really quite simple. Now to attach this tab to the back of the frame, I'm going to be using number 8 by 5/8 inch long flathead screws. So I want to drill a pilot hole through this tab so that the wood doesn't split when we drive everything in. And of course you do want to countersink it. It's ideal to drill it now while you got something to hold on to. Now the hole is about a 1/2 inch in from the end. That'd be about centrally located. Then we want the tab to project out over the mirror by about 3/8 of an inch. So pencil that in, cut it off with the table saw, and then we're done. Now I've taken the little felt dot, attached it to the little tab of wood, put that in, and like I said, a number 8 by 5/8 inch long screw. Now don't over tighten this, you don't want to crack the mirror. Just get the screws in, and that's it. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up construction of our mirror project. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.